Welcome. I'm Carol Lee, founder and CEO of WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters. And on behalf of WHAM and our partner in the brain health space, the Bright Focus Foundation, thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a fascinating discussion with the foremost leaders in women's brain health. June 2023 will mark the 30th anniversary of the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993, which established guidelines for the inclusion of women and minorities in all NIH-funded clinical trials and research. And at that time, it took a committed bipartisan group of legislators who collaborated with many different constituents, including patients, providers, advocates, and policymakers to develop and approve this momentous event. But we still have a long way to go. WHAM is determined to build a new dialogue and platform to shift these imbalances, which still exist. Even though progress has been made, accelerating women's health research and investment is an economic imperative that offers tremendous returns for small investments to the well-being of our society. Joining me today are exceptional leaders in their field. Meryl Comer, the vice chair of WHAM and co-founder of Us Against Alzheimer's, will moderate our panel discussion, which features Dr. Rachel Buckley. And you're going to meet each of these people, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Dr. Malu Tanzi, Dr. Sharon Rossi, and I am missing Rebecca Chopp, but I know you're there. I'm so grateful to all who could join us today, and I would now like to turn the conversation to our moderator, my dear colleague, Meryl Comer. And addition to being in the vice chair of WHAM, Meryl has been just an extraordinary board member and friend, and has served on the NIH National Advisory Council on Aging as a principal investigator for the PCORI Alzheimer's patient caregiver and research network. And of course, you must, if you haven't, read Meryl's best-selling New York Times bestseller, Slow Dancing with a Stranger, which supports Alzheimer's research. And Meryl, we thank you so much for joining us in this dialogue today and for all you do for WHAM.
Thank you, Carolee. It's an honor to be on the board and share this journey with you. Welcome, everyone. Today, as women, irrespective of age, we share a sensibility that longevity in some way will take its toll, because we know that not only do we outlive men, but women are disproportionately and differentially impacted by diseases ranging from heart, cancer, autoimmune, and conditions affecting our brain. For example, 2/3 of the 6.7 million people in the US suffering from Alzheimer's disease, which, by the way, is the biggest concern of people 55 plus, according to polling. And 2/3 of the caregivers are women. Women are twice as likely than men to suffer from depression, which is the leading cause of disability globally. So it's up to all of us to find and take a lead on the future of what healthy aging looks like. And there's no better place to begin than with our brains ourselves. Now let's meet our distinguished panel. I'm going to give you their official title, but I've asked them each to share a short snapshot of their personal attraction to careers in neuroscience and their specific areas of research today. Leading off is Dr. Rachel Buckley, Assistant Professor, Department of Neurology at Mass General Hospital, Harvard Medical School. Rachel, welcome. You're Australian, trained at the University of Melbourne. Share the journey to your current research position at Harvard.
Thank you so much, Meryl. I would really like to first thank you to WHAM and to the Bright Focus Foundation for inviting me today. It really has been a long journey for me, I suppose, from the beginnings in Australia all the way now to the United States. I've always been incredibly interested in Alzheimer's disease dementia. I have a personal history of dementia, as I'm sure many of the listeners here would have. And I, in particular, was really taken by the idea of the earliest markers of the disease. What are sort of the signals that we can see, whether it's behaviorally or with memory or something that we can actually visualize on a neuroimaging scan that can give us an indication of where someone might likely end up over a few decades in the future. So I started out at the University of Melbourne, as you said, really looking into subjective memory concerns. I was very curious about why people might be worried about their memory and what that might portend for the future, especially if they are performing completely normally on memory and thinking tasks. And some of the findings that I had during my PhD was that women actually do tend to have slightly different concerns than men. But more importantly, the thing that we found was that women tend to have a much better intuition of their own cognitive health, their brain health. And this was very fascinating to me. Around about the time when I was finishing my PhD, I was very lucky to witness a talk from Dr. Risa Sperling, who is one of my champions in science, Alzheimer's disease specifically. And I knew from that moment I wanted to follow her across the world and train under her. She was very gracious with me, and she offered me a position as a postdoctoral fellow at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. And I went very shortly after my PhD. One of the first things that she wanted me to look at when I arrived was to look into sex differences. In particular, her interest was in why do women seem to be more vulnerable to the disease than men. And we were very, very focused as the forefront lab in the United States. We really focus on multimodal neuroimaging. We look at positron emission tomography scans. We look at magnetic resonance imaging. We put all of this neuroimaging data together, all in older adults who are entirely healthy in terms of memory and thinking. And we follow them over time with these scans, as well as with memory and thinking tests. So what I was really tasked with doing was trying to look within the brain, whether there were differences in proteins that we know are very closely associated with Alzheimer's disease, amyloid and tau. And what I found, it was quite remarkable. Our earliest work really showed that there seemed to be very significant differences between older men and women in the levels of tau in their brain. And it wasn't just limited to certain areas, it seemed to be across lots of different regions of the brain. The other interesting thing we found was that there didn't seem to be that much difference in amyloid. So there seemed to be this interesting story developing of what might be going on. And this wasn't just coming out from our group. After we published our initial findings, which caused a bit of a stir, we were finding that other labs, independent studies were finding a similar finding. And it wasn't just limited to neuroimaging. There were post-mortem evidence. There was evidence in cerebrospinal fluid. There were a lot of things sort of gathering and mounting at that time. This was about 5-7 years ago. And what we've really recently, this is where I'm at now. I'm now an assistant professor of neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital. I absolutely love Boston. My lab is now really focusing on what could be driving this. I know that in the recent panel discussions that have been happening, we've been talking about what might be driving this. And our focus in our lab is really on this menopause transition. I really strongly believe there's a nexus of change occurring during this time. And it's really a driving force, an area that we're really interested in, not just hormonally, but the things that are happening around that menopause time, the symptoms that are occurring, sleep changes, mood changes, irritability, sex drive, all sorts of different vasomotor symptoms like hot flushes. All of these things could be contributing to what we might be seeing in terms of vulnerability. On top of it, we're also interested in the X chromosome. So that's sort of a nutshell of how I started out and where I am now.
So we are going to go deeper into that conversation. A quick footnote on your remarkable mentor. She was also an opera singer. Risa Sperling has a reputation of being an exceptional opera singer as well. Thank you so much. Our next guest, Dr. Malu Tanzi, professor and co-director of the Center for Translational Research in Neurodegenerative Disease and Parkinson's Foundation Research Center of Excellence, the College of Medicine, University of Florida. Malu, welcome. And Malu, women multitask. Malu is in an airport waiting for a plane. So we're going to make the most of our time together, Malu. Most of your
Great.
work centers around the role of inflammation in neurodegenerative disease. But what compelled you to become a researcher with such a broad portfolio of research that runs from Parkinson's to Alzheimer's?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to see this amazing panel of women, all their accomplishments and what they still have to deliver to the field. Really great to see them. I would say that my interest in science began very early in high school with my chemistry teacher, Margaret Jackson. We went to a lot of science fairs, and I ended up, really loving research. I was part of an NSF program at UC Davis during high school that allowed me to really start studying genetics and some of the genes that conferred resistance to some of the wheat in California. So from there, I was at Stanford. I loved biology, and I decided that I wanted to study everything there was to know about the human body. My uncle was a doctor, and I ended up then going to grad school at UT Southwestern. It was a wonderful time, and I had a fantastic mentor, and I still keep in touch with him, Jim Stoll. And from there, I did a postdoc in neuroscience. So up until that time, I was a physiologist, trained in all systems. And so I've always had this appreciation for what the organs do outside the brain that might impact the brain. And after my postdoc, I went to biotech, which is a little unusual. I decided I was going to work fewer hours and make more money. Well, the make more money part was right. The fewer hours, not so much, because I think once you're a workaholic, you're always a workaholic. But I loved it, and I learned about inflammation and innate immunity and adaptive immunity. And I think this is where people's trajectories, really guide you in terms of you have no good guess about what's going to happen in the future. And I think you always have to be ready to sort of embrace the changes that your career takes, and then find a way to reinvent yourself and just combine the different interests that you have. So I combined my interest in inflammation with my interest in neuroscience and neurodegeneration, and came back to academia, set up my lab in 2002, and started working on the role of inflammation on the brain. And at the time, there was not a lot published. The McGears were really at the forefront of it, showing activated immune cells in autopsy brains of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's patients. But I was determined that there probably was a role for the immune system, not necessarily an injurious role, but I consider the microglia, which are the innate immune cells of the brain, to be like first responders, right? They're the sentinels of keeping the house clean and the dependent children, the neurons happy and working well. And what happens is that at some point, they're aging too. The neurons, the microglia, the immune cells are aging right along with you. And we know that some of the biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is aging. And so it turns out that as you're aging, and as a function of your genetics and environment, lifestyle choices, physical activity, you end up with sort of a lifetime risk for neurodegenerative disease, where you can't really change your genetics, but you can certainly modify your environment and the lifestyle choices that you're able to make to be able to lessen your risk or delay onset or potentially delay progression. And so that's where my lab has focused on, to understand what are the earliest signs that you can see in the immune system, in the blood, in the CSF, maybe in the gut, to see that there's a predisposition that the immune cells are responding to, decades before the onset of memory forgetting and the onset of motor symptoms in the case of Parkinson's. So that's the question. How does your immune system protect or predispose you to these age-related neurodegenerative diseases? And in addition to others, neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and FTD that are not necessarily affecting older people, it's kind of a common hallmark of neurodegeneration. So by studying how to modulate inflammation, how to lessen chronic inflammation, which is the real culprit, I think we'll be able to make some headway in a lot of different diseases and maybe lessen the chance that you will be able to, have that be diagnosed with it. And instead of having a long lifespan, you'll have a longer health span.
We're trying to connect the two, brain span and lifespan, Malu.
That's right.
We are going to, again, go deeper into your research areas of stress, the microbiome, and the immune responses. Joining us now is Rebecca Chopp with a storied academic career as the 18th and first female chancellor of the University of Denver, former president of Swarthmore College and Colgate University, and dean and professor of theology at Yale Divinity School. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. A quick profile of how challenging was your personal journey to those top academic positions that you've held?
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm so excited about all these researchers. I wouldn't be doing as well as I am doing with Alzheimer's if it wasn't for these researchers. I grew up in semi-rural Kansas. Parents were working class, did not believe in the education of girls. And I was basically prepared to be a housewife, which would have been fine. I thought I could have 9 kids and a ranch and that'd be all fun. Didn't take college prep courses, but ended up in college, and teachers, great teachers, recognized that there was some intelligence there. And so I landed up at University of Chicago, got a PhD in theology and philosophy of theology, and went to Emory to teach. And I taught there for 14 years. And like other women my age, I have a whole series of firsts. Meryl, I'm sure you do too. First this and first that. I became the first female provost at Emory and then went on to Yale and got kind of bitten by the administrative bug and knew how important it was for women to be engaged in leadership positions, that we had much to give to the world, as well as being mothers and other kinds of things. So I finally came to the University of Denver. I was so happy to be here. I love Colorado, and developed a plan with the university to really transform the university and work closely with Denver and promote research, promote teaching, promote scholarship for the public good. So a lot of battles, but also a lot of opportunities.
Rebecca, a profile in the Chronicle of Higher Education capsulized your career in a very poignant way with a headline, "The Reinvention of Rebecca Chopp. She built a life around a profession that prizes the mind." And then she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. What was your life plan and how did it change with the diagnosis?
Well, I really was kind of a brain with a body attached. My brain was my greatest tool, my asset, my entree to the world. And I wanted to work another 5 years. I was 69 when I got diagnosed, being the chancellor of DU and seeing all these wonderful projects. I was traveling the world. It was an adventure that I never could have imagined possible. And then I got diagnosed. And it was a brilliant primary care physician who really saw the signs more than I did. And I was first given a diagnosis by a neurologist saying that in 3 years I wouldn't be buttoning my shirt. And my primary care physician, I decided maybe I'd switch neurologist. And then I found one who talked about the lifestyle interventions, the exercise of 2 or 3 hours a day, diet, creativity. I took up art, engagement. And so on the one hand, my life came to a halt, a screeching halt. Everything changed overnight. On the other hand, as I struggled in kind of the shadows and darkness of that diagnosis, that neurologist, who was really well informed, kind of helped me move into a new reinvention.
Now, Rebecca, the fact is that no two cases are alike and the rate of progression varies. Where are you now clinically in the disease? And more importantly, how do you feel?
You were so right to say everybody's different. My mother and my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and tremendous differences in our family experience, also tremendous educational levels and fitness levels and other things. I'm in the early stages, but I've been in that early stage for 4 years. And given the first diagnosis I had, I'm doing very well. Short-term memories of pain. I was always very worried that I'm going to put the ice cream in the pantry, which I have done. Many trips downstairs, and I've forgotten what I wanted and all that. I don't drive except to a grocery store, which is less than a mile away. I can't stand social crowds, and I lived in social crowds. But yet, I really think in my case, genetics and environment and all this hard work has paid off. I'm living with a lot of joy. I love my art. I've become an advocate, as you know, for Alzheimer's awareness, for research for Alzheimer's, for educating physicians, and working on a book now called Not Your Grandmother's Alzheimer's.
So why is it not your grandmother's Alzheimer's? Because this is a critical point, because there is such stigma around the disease.
It is, and I had that stigma myself. My grandmother was one of those who sat in the wheelchair, tied to the wheelchair, looking blankly. And now we can diagnose it earlier. In my case, I think I got diagnosed fairly early. I was very fortunate. We can do more about it. There are drugs, of course, coming on the market, if CMS will provide for us, for some of us anyway. But there's also this tremendous amount of lifestyle intervention. Now, it's not going to work for everyone. I understand that. It will work for some longer than others. But if we can improve the quality of those years, if we can give people joy and purpose to live, to give back, to create, we will have done so much. We have to change the narrative as well as the treatment around Alzheimer's.
And I think that reframing may come from your background as a theologian, but we're going to get into that a little deeper later. And I'm sure you're excited when you hear about these young women researchers and what they're up to.
I am so excited and proud and pleased and supportive.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Dr. Sharon Rossi, Director, Scientific Programs, Neuroscience at the Bright Focus Foundation, that has a reputation for bold funding of early stage investigators, several of whom have gone on to win a Nobel Prize. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us. How did your research career lead you to a Bright Focus Foundation?
Well, I just want to say I'm completely humbled and honored to be part of this panel as well. I mean, I'm happy to say that Dr. Stancy and Buckley are not only colleagues, but also friends. And Dr. Chopp, I mean, I just admire your strength and perseverance. So I have studied the brain for as long as I can remember. I went to my undergraduate university because there was a program in neuroscience, and I just knew that was something that I wanted to study for the rest of my life. I would never get bored of the brain. All the different other disciplines that feed into the brain were just so intriguing to me. And I really kind of also wanted to help people, and I wanted to be part of a translational type research setting. So I went on in graduate school to study actually spinal cord injury and stem cell therapies for spinal cord injury. And interestingly, in spinal cord injury, the main model that people generally use are female rodents, which is different than almost every other disease and research paradigm that people are looking at. And it always kind of bothered me. I always wondered, if we were looking at males as well, would we be finding the same differences? But now I feel like I'm outdating myself, because it was only until 2016 that NIH actually said that you have to use both males and females in studies. And I think that all too frequently that is technically discarded sometimes in science. So of many things that we need to work on, but I think I took a very circuitous route in my research. I liked the brain so much that I wasn't sure exactly where my passion laid. I know I was really interested in neurodegeneration and promoting repair and plasticity after injuries. It didn't really matter to me what disease or model I was looking at. So I went on and studied spinal muscular atrophy. I studied traumatic brain injury, and then I wound up at the National Institute on Aging. And there I was looking at mechanisms of just normal cognitive aging across many different animal models, but I had the pleasure of working with non-human primates and really looking longitudinally at how their brain connectivity, so connectivity between different brain regions, was changing as they aged. And I had the luxury at NIA to have enough animals that I could stratify based on sex. So I thought, well, why don't we just look at males and females? How different are aged males and females? And the differences were so striking. And then I said, well, what about young males and females? Are they the same or different? And the results there were even more striking. And so it was so obvious to me that even in young males and females, in non-human primates, their connectivity patterns or signatures in their brain were so different that it was just something that I couldn't believe that the field has been so largely ignoring for so long. So that really kind of impassioned me to be an advocate for sex-based difference research. And while my multidisciplinary background, I think, in the academic sector can maybe be looked at as like a hindrance or possibly unfocused, it set me up perfectly for my position at Bright Focus. So we take a very holistic approach, an investigator-led approach. We want the investigators to tell us where the unmet needs are in the field. And using my multidisciplinary background, then I'm kind of able to have a more 360-degree view of the field, where it needs to go, where the unmet needs are. And when we're looking at these multifactorial diseases that encompass many systems, they're ultimately going to need a multidisciplinary approach. And so I'm really excited to be at Bright Focus, where we can kind of move the field where it needs to go with our funding initiatives and also our education initiatives.
Let me just ask you, so there's transparency. Have you funded any of the researchers who are on this?
Maybe, no, I'm just kidding.
Maybe.
We fund quite a few of Dr. Tansey's students, and I'm not sure if Dr. Tansey, I think a long time ago, she might have had an award from us. We've been around for nearly 50 years now, so I'm proud to say there's probably not many people in the Alzheimer's field we have not funded, especially some of, the more seasoned professors now we fund their students.
So let's broaden and bring everyone in for a conversation about each of your specialties. What do we know in your specialties, genetic versus environmental, and how can we override the environmental in some ways? So Malu, why don't we pull you back in and let you start the dialogue, and then we'll move on to Rachel and bring everybody along.
Certainly. So, the way we think about the immune system is it's the arbiter of how your body deals with an invader, right? A pathogen, an environmental exposure. A lot of these things are what trigger immune responses. And if you have good genes, that regulate your immune cells well, and they activate and then they shut back down after the pathogen or the threat is done, that's great. As you're getting older, that process doesn't work as well. And when you have comorbidities like type 2 diabetes, chronic systemic inflammatory diseases, autoimmune diseases, there's a lot that doesn't shut down. So you have this constant inflammation in your body. And when you have another exposure or another insult, maybe a fall or an infection, then that acts as an additional trigger on top of whatever immune activation you already have in your body. So the way we think of the immune system and differences is that if you have good genes that regulate your immune responses, that's great. But you're going to have a series of lifetime exposures after that, which are like a dance card that determines your lifetime risk because of these all gene by environment interactions.
So it looks like you're walking somewhere. So what I'm going to do is move over to Rachel. Rachel, you're the genetics versus the environmental. And what was striking to me is typically diagnosis comes for diseases like Alzheimer's, 75, 80. It can go much younger if it's genetic. If you back down 20 or 30 years, first symptoms appear around 70, 75. You hit menopause, and that is your focus. Tell us what we can do in this space right now, what we know and what we should be doing.
Meryl, you absolutely hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the pitch that I usually make when I'm speaking to people about my passion, which is looking at this idea of what's going on in the life course during a whole woman's life, what is changing and what could be preceding this risk that we know that women tend to bear. And I guess there's a few different elements to this. There's a good story and a cautionary tale, I would say. I'll start off with the cautionary tale. Some of the most sort of impactful and convincing evidence I've seen at a population level of women's risk for dementia, Alzheimer's disease in particular, is the literature that's looking at the ApoE4 allele. This is the well-known genetic risk factor for the general sporadic case. It's not a mutation that definitively gives a dementia diagnosis, but if you carry the ApoE4 allele, as we, some of us in the audience may have, it does increase your risk of progressing to the dementia. And what we found, there was one particular study actually conducted by Judy Parr and colleagues at UCSD, that was really focused on looking at this interaction. So women who carry the E4 allele, what does that mean for their risk relative to men who carry the E4 allele? And what they found was an almost doubled risk of progression, but only between the ages of this 65 to 75 year age range, which was fascinating to me and to that lab, because if you take the well-known duration of Alzheimer's disease from the point of an abnormal amyloid scan, for instance, all the way to the point of a diagnosis, there's been quite a few estimates that have been thrown out suggesting there's about a 20-year life course there from the initial point of seeing abnormality on this scan to the point of a diagnosis. If you take that 65 to 75 year age range back in that time frame, you're looking 45 to 55, which Meryl exactly overlaps with what you were arguing for, which is this menopause period. So there's this argument there that women do have some level of exacerbated risk if they're an E4 carrier, and I can talk about at a general level why that might be if anyone is interested. But there certainly seems to be an interesting role to play there. But it's not all bad news. There are also some other components of the gene profile that we're starting to only recently really understand. So, for instance, women live longer than men. This is not something that is surprising to anyone. Across the world and across most species, the female will live longer. Also, additional to that, women with dementia will also live much longer than men with dementia. So there is a very strong argument to be made for women actually being incredibly resilient. If I was ever going to, get dementia, I would want to be a woman, honestly. There are some very interesting genes, particularly on the X chromosome, that seem to be giving us some indication of some resiliency built in, hard-coded into the gene pool. And the idea of that is that women have two X chromosomes, one from their mother, one from their father, and men only get the X from their mother. The issue with that is that if there's some kind of mutation on the X, women can compensate for that, because across every cell in our body, one of these X's will automatically shut off randomly, and we don't know which one that will be. But because of that, we have this beautiful mosaicism, and we can often use some of the genes that are on this X chromosome to try to counteract some of the issues that we see. And this also somewhat overlaps with Malu's area of research, because a lot of these genes that are on the X are somewhat associated with immune responses, immune pathways. And so I think that the story of the gene by environment interaction, particularly when we're thinking about women's health, is quite an interesting one and quite nuanced.
So I'm sure many of the women in the audience, if they are 40 to 50, they want to know, what should they be doing? I mean, how do they improve their odds? Mm. And for those of us 60 plus, what do we do to improve our odds? Do we have any degree of control?
Well, I would absolutely defer to Rebecca's beautiful comments that she made earlier, when she said that there were so many things that her neurologist had recommended. And I would just like to absolutely congratulate that neurologist, because they were absolutely right. Anything that is good for your heart is good for your brain. So you want to be doing exercise, you want to be eating well, whatever your grandmother would eat, you would eat. So highly processed foods and having a takeaway or takeout every night may not be the ideal course of action. Maintaining social connections as much as you can, really trying to stretch your brain in ways that you may not have before, pick up a new language or pick up art, something that involves creativity, sort of really exploring things you may not have before. Those sorts of things are usually just common sense and generally a good idea. But I certainly would recommend for women around that age, particularly menopause, is really thinking about those things. And I know the other component to this is the menopause transition itself, the symptoms that are associated. And I'm happy to speak to that a little bit, but I do want to have a disclaimer that I myself am not a clinician. I'm just in research, but I'm happy to speak to that if anybody's interested.
But the issue of hormone therapy, and I'll be very honest with you, they stopped paying for it in most healthcare plans after a certain age. So is this something women need to fight for? What is your instinct as a researcher right now?
Well, I'm not sure if people have been paying much attention to the media over the past week, but we just released a finding from our lab. Dr. Gillian Coughlin was the leader on that work, and we were featured in CNN, which was wonderful. Basically, our recent work has looked at the impacts of previous use of hormone therapy on brain levels of amyloid and tau during life in older women who are entirely cognitively healthy. And what we noticed was that earlier age at menopause was associated with higher levels of tau. If you recall, I was saying tau seems to be a particular key player. But we also counterintuitively found that those women taking hormone therapy also showed higher levels of tau, which was somewhat confusing, because you would obviously think, well, if I have earlier age at menopause, surely I should try to replenish with exogenous estrogens by taking hormone therapy. And what I would like to say at this point is that I don't believe it's all hormone therapy cases. What we noticed when we really delved into the literature, into the data, and also in what we know from past clinical trials, is if there's a significant delay between the time of menopause onset and the time at which you might initiate hormone therapy, I'm talking 5 or 10 years duration, that is when we start to see increased levels of risk for women. So does that mean we need to throw out all hormone therapy? Well, actually, I personally, as a researcher, would say no. The argument there is that the only therapeutic, the only way to properly treat menopause symptoms is really with hormone therapy. As much as we can try to ameliorate them with lifestyle modification, the proper, the thing that we know works best is hormone therapy. So I think there's a way to be able to sort of hold these two tensions in mind and allow for safe use of hormone therapy, but perhaps not for long periods of time and perhaps not after a big duration between the two.
Thank you. Let's bring all of our other guests online, and I hope Malu has landed someplace where she can join us as well. I do want to open it up to Rebecca. For so many of us, there is such high anxiety about getting a diagnosis, especially if we've seen it in our families. And you mentioned both your grandmother and your mother. How do we balance the anxiety and fear of the need to know? And what do you say to those who prefer not to know?
I often have people tell me they'd rather not know. And, I respond by saying, knowledge is power. You can get your life in order. You can take care of your estate plans or whatever you have. You can set up your future. I mean, it's sad to think of just bumbling along and then expecting your family to have to take care of it all. You can do lifestyle intervention. I think, way past being able to have hormone therapy, but I love hearing that news. But there are things you can do. Again, it may not prolong your life past 10 or 20 years, but the quality of your life can expand. You can kind of reinvent yourself. You can experience joy, time with loved ones. It's one thing to just think, oh yeah, daily, my husband's home, that's nice. It's another thing to think, I know what I'm going to die of most likely. I have a limited time. You can experience that. You can, most importantly, even beyond your own enjoyment, participate in trials, be an advocate, help change the narrative. Let's make it at least so our children and grandchildren have a better experience with this disease than those of us living now. You can give back in an awesome and powerful way right now. But to do all those things, from joy to giving back, you got to know you have the disease. And yes, there is a time of great darkness and lamentation and grief, but you can move beyond that.
And that's where your training as the dean of Yale Divinity School helps, I think, in reframing how you live in a space that is one that you don't want to sugarcoat because of the tragedy involved, but you have found a safe place to enjoy life. Rachel, you declared that you're a 3-4. What does a 3-4 mean? I'm a 3-4, but I too have spent my life caring for loved ones with the disease, and I had to know because it would help me frame my life. How about you, Rachel? Malu, we have you for a moment, so let me go to Malu first.
Yeah, no problem. I think it's fairly common, right, to be a 3-4. And I think what's important is, as Rebecca said, knowledge is power. It's almost as if she's been listening to my talks, because I do think that you want to be able to make decisions about participating in trials, having your loved ones participate in trials. My goal is for my kids and grandkids never to have to worry about dementia. I mean, to just have a very healthy and long life. But it is about quality. And some people don't want to know because they would be too anxious. And so I get that. I think that, aging to a long life is a privilege not afforded to everyone. And we want to use our time, yes, if it was the last day, because you could step off the curb and that might be it. And so, Rebecca, maybe you don't know what you're going to die of. And I would say that your attitude of just get as much joy out of what you're doing is exactly what we want to do.
So on that area, I want to go to Sharon, because Sharon, this whole area of sex, the differences between men and women, the sex-based differences, how does it relate? Because you're also looking, Bright Focus is about the eye as well as the brain and how they interconnect.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's interesting. So unfortunately, the vision field, I think, is a little bit behind the brain field with regard to sex-based differences. It's not as much of a hot topic. So we had discussed, we fund exceptional research across our 3 programs, Alzheimer's disease, macular degeneration, and glaucoma. But we also like to educate the next generation of scientists, and we do that generally through our fast track programs. And so both Rachel and Malu have frequented our fast track for Alzheimer's disease, and sex-based differences are always at the forefront of the most unmet need, I think, across all the other disciplines, the genetics talks, the endocrinology talks, the inflammation talks. I mean, they all have something, so sex-based differences that need to be addressed. And we really encourage the new investigators to look at these differences when warranted. And our vision programs were doing the same thing. Again, knowledge is power. I think that some of the newer investigators coming in might not even be thinking that this is an unmet need or something that really needs to be looked at. And as we enter this realm of precision medicine or personalized medicine, we really need to include the other half of the population that's largely been ignored.
I'd like to bring WHAM's fearless leader, Carol Lee, back into our conversation to join us, because I think we both feel that we are pushing up against time. Rebecca, we understand the sense of time and that we want things to happen sooner rather than later. So Carol Lee, do you want to frame the final area of conversation and what these women want in 3, not 30 years to happen?
Well, thank you, Meryl. First of all, thank you for the brilliant leadership in moderating and creating such a dynamic dialogue with these extraordinary women who are clearly at the forefront of their field. One of the reasons that WHAM was founded was to make sure that women who are and diseases that affect women disproportionately, exclusively, or predominantly, such as Alzheimer's, were studied and much more greatly than they are, as has been pointed out. And in order to do that, WHAM has been trying to figure out what kind of strategies we could develop, including obviously through the WHAM report, showing that there are economic reasons to create more research for women, because the gains are that much greater, and because women drive economies. So one of the areas that we started focusing on was a strategy and a social media strategy, which is called #3not30. And it's basically our call to action. And why is that? Well, it's because we believe that collectively, as women, we do have the economic power to create change. And we recognize that women do drive the economy. And just to, frame that a little bit before I turn it back to you, Meryl, in the US, women make up more than 50% of the workforce, and 52% of the population own 60% of the wealth in the country, are over 85% of consumer spending, and are the chief health officers of their families. They make 80% of healthcare decisions. Women drive the economy. Clearly, if we keep women healthy, we have healthier economies, healthier societies. And in June, we're going to be collaborating with our partners, such as Bright Focus, to focus on the innovation and ideas which will need to be created and shared in order to create change in 3 years, not 30. And the 30, remember, comes back to this, is we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Revitalization Act. So WHAM's 3 Not 30 campaign is focused on what needs to be achieved in the next 3 years. And we think significant things can happen. So Meryl, I think you want to ask a few questions of your guests, our guests, before I have some final comments.
So let's bring them all back up together if we can. And Malu, I'm going to let you go first because I know you have to run. So the challenge is, what do you want to happen in 3, not 30 years? Be a forecaster.
So, for me, I think the earlier detection is key. So we need biomarkers, imaging biomarkers, blood biomarkers, immune biomarkers, so that we can understand the kind of Alzheimer's, the kind of dementia people have, because it's very different for different people. And one size is not ever going to fit all. So for those people who think we now have drugs that have, effects, albeit modest, we can't stop there. We need many more therapies and adjunct therapies to be able to treat dementia and really prevent it. That's where I think the emphasis in the field is going to go, because prevention is going to be much easier than treatment.
But it will take that push, right? It doesn't happen by itself.
That's right. Multidisciplinary approaches between different institutes, the government, foundations.
Sharon?
Well, I think you guys know I have many 3, not 30s, but I'll try to keep it short here. I mean, professionally, I think that we just need a massive push toward the acknowledgement that these sex differences exist. I mean, we need a paradigm shift in thinking. I think the lack of a holistic approach to medicine just in general in Western societies inevitably is causing this divide between the sexes. And at Bright Focus, I mean, we try to just partner with women, prioritize women, promote women, and even protect women to make sure that they're retained in science and that they can reach these leadership positions, because for the last decade, we've been waiting for that to happen. And there's something that's not translating. Women are still not in these leadership positions that we've expected them to be in for the last decade. And I think that we can agree once they are, then there will be a trickle down effect and hopefully more equity in health research and healthcare in general.
Rachel?
Yeah, I really love these other takes. My feeling was when I was thinking about this particular 3, not 30, I was thinking about what would I like to see happening over the next 3 years. And I really went to a microcosm because research is my area. And so I thought, okay, what are the research questions I think could really drastically change the field? And if we could just get them started, we may not be able to answer them in 3 years, but we'd be very close. So one of the big things that we could easily do right now is that a lot of these clinical trials on Alzheimer's disease, they often do not disaggregate their findings by sex, and really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of, are women being treated in the same way? Are they having the same treatment response? Are there ways that we can better fine-tune therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease in women? These are questions that I think we could answer right now because we have data to hand. I also have a really big blue sky excitement for a project that I would love to see funded somehow, but I know that it will take a lot of sort of concerted effort across multiple different groups and funding bodies. But if somebody asked me what my dream would be, what I would love to see is a deep and comprehensive phenotyping of women from the age of 40 to 60. We gather these women at the baseline and we follow them for as long as we possibly can. And we do very, very careful workup of their reproductive health, their medication history, everything we can think about their lifestyle factors. And then in the future, a few decades down the line, again, this is 3 and 30 now, thinking about how they end up in life. Right now, there is a way to be able to get some of the deeply phenotyped cohorts from a long time ago that gathered a lot of information on menopause and be able to measure those women now. It's been a few decades, for instance, since the Women's Health Initiative started. These women had a lot of information collected on them, and no one's really followed up on them in terms of Alzheimer's disease markers. So that is one thing we can do in 3 years. So I've got a lot of ideas, and I think in the research space, this is an exciting time, and I feel really optimistic right now of where we're going and where we're headed.
Just listening to you, it sounded like you were recreating Framingham of the brain studies that we have, and we now have data, and we have artificial intelligence to accelerate Rebecca, it's 3, not 30. I'm sure you've thought about what you want to have accomplished in 3, not 30 years.
Well, the first one is I want more women researchers on the brain like these that we're hearing from. Wow. So yes, let's keep supporting them. I'll have a different take because I'm not a scientist. I hope in 3 years we have a quick test primary care physicians can give. That is still a huge stopping ground. Primary care physicians themselves don't want to test. When they test, they don't want to tell people. We need something clear and factual, biometric vision. I don't care what it is, you all find it. We need that. And second, once we have that, we need more neurologists. We need more neurologists who have a great big toolkit to help people treat their own individual journey of dementia and Alzheimer's.
I think we have to start in med school on some of that training. Thank you so much. We could go on and continue our conversation. Carol Lee, Malu, have a safe journey. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Meryl, and thanks to everyone. I think, the only other thing that I'd like to add, that our goal, which encapsulates some of what each of our wonderful panelists have said, is for this roundtable, is for each of our partners and participants to commit to a change within their community or institution in order to create greater equity and equality, to create more research, which we need in women, and investment, which they can then implement over the next 3 years, not 30. So we hope all of you will join us in creating your own ideas around 3, not 30, so that collectively we're creating sustainable and impactful momentum and advancing contributions that we know can be made to society. For more information on WHAM, we invite you to visit whamnow.org or the whamreport.org, and to follow us, of course, on social media. But most importantly, thank you, Meryl. Thank you to all of the extraordinary researchers. Rebecca, even though you're not a researcher, you are in some way. And we look forward to seeing you at our next dialogue in the series, which will be on May 18th, and it's focused on women and cancer. Thank you all so much. You're just superstars, and we're so grateful. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.